All right, so welcome to this first session of the Faces of Science Park 2022 week, in which we celebrate diversity and inclusion in science. And we thought it might be useful to start the whole week with a quite simple introduction to the question, why would a lack of diversity and inclusion be bad for science? So my name is Machiel Keestra. I'm a philosopher of science, and I'm the faculty diversity officer for another couple of months. And also since last week, I am the central diversity officer of the University of Amsterdam. And I'm going to walk you through a series of arguments showing that if science is not as diverse and inclusive as it should be, it really impedes science in many, many different ways. So I've listed a whole series of perspectives on this question. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think it covers quite well the most important ingredients of this topic. And I'll walk you through the 5 dimensions, the 5 different perspectives that I've highlighted here, ranging from, I'm going in a way from outside, from external perspectives, gradually to an internal perspective. So I'm starting with an ethical perspective on this question, and I'll end towards, in about 25 minutes, on the how a lack of diversity and inclusion will impede this functioning of science and scientists, really an internal perspective. So, of course, I will offer some examples here and there, but it will be relatively brief. So really meant to offer you kind of a broad general insight, and then some points for discussion afterwards. So when we are thinking about ethical reasons or arguments why a lack of diversity and inclusion might be bad for science, we're thinking, of course, about ethical norms of justice and fairness, the norms that political and ethical philosopher John Rawls has highlighted, but is considered quite generally as very basic norms for how society thrives, and also how maybe how science should operate. And here you find the 10 priority areas that UNESCO has designated for science and scientific researchers. And they say, well, in a way, science really has also a responsibility towards the United Nations ideals of human dignity, progress, justice, etc. And these norms also include that science is not isolated from society, but really has a role in interacting with society, responding to calls of society, and also offering spontaneously, as you like, insights, scientific insights to society. And then, of course, the question is, well, if science is less diverse and less inclusive than it should be, can it still really fulfill that role? Can it still meaningfully interact with society or not? Can it really contribute to these universal ideals of human dignity? And there are several considerations here. Of course, if we as scientists and as science try to really be part of a just society, it means that we would treat all citizens in a fair way. And that is, we offer them a just and fair access to science and to our research, to our results, to the education of science. And if we do not do that, it really will, as I will show also in the rest of this presentation, it will hamper science. But also, if we don't grant citizens a fair access to science and scientific results, it will also create distrust and suspicion in science. And as we've all witnessed in recent years, so during the COVID-19 pandemic, suspicion against science is really something that really is not just affecting science, but also the regulations, the vaccinations, and as a result, really the treatment, the response to the COVID vaccine. And here in a recent poll by the Pew Research Center, US-based research center of last year, 2020, I have to say, you can see that the trust in science is not that large, and indeed it is somewhat threatened. Of course, we can still be fairly satisfied. Also in the Netherlands, I've highlighted it with a relatively high level of trust. But as we know, trust comes by foot, but it really leaves on horse shoes. So we shouldn't treat this as something that we shouldn't be careful about. Now, apart from ethical reasons, there are also societal reasons. Of course, the two are closely related. So as a society, we are, in democratic societies, we are looking for representation. And there's, to some extent, also a matter of representation in and by science. So citizens and groups of citizens should, in a way, consider themselves being represented in science, or their interests and their norms should be represented in science. And indeed, the League of European Research Universities, of which the University of Amsterdam is also a member, they highlighted several opportunities, as they call it, opportunities for universities that might bring long-term benefits to our societies. And they say, well, in a way, science should better reflect society, and in doing so, be able to connect local and global challenges. Because as a scientist, we also bring our own interests, we bring our own norms to the lab, to the research environment. And if we are not as inclusive and diverse as we should be, then it really will also imply that we don't bring all interests and all norms, all values to the lab, to the research environment. And it might imply that we should reconsider the definitions of excellence and success at society, in the academic community. That is, we might find that there's a lack of representation and equal representation of different groups in science. And it might be that, that we have created obstacles for accessing science and scientific results that bias against certain groups. For instance, we've seen, and we are still witnessing, that there's a leaky pipeline with regard to women in science. So it has turned out that we have created undesirable obstacles for women in their accessing science or the higher ranks in science. And as we will see further below, this has also created undesirable scientific outcomes. That is, we've under-attended to the interests, the health, for instance, of women in science. And if you are looking, again, there are more data from the US, unfortunately, than from European situations. So you will find in these presentations that I relatively often refer to American data. Well, here you find data from the STEM sciences, so science and engineering more generally. And here is the general population. And what we would expect that in an equal and fair representation of the population in science, that there are these like horizontal shades between the resident population and the population in science and engineering. However, what you will find are these skewed or diagonal shades, and they show that there is something amiss in the representation. So as you can find here, there are much less females, white females in the STEM sciences than males. And if we are looking, for instance, and again, these are American data, but I'm afraid in the European context, it's not really that much different. If you look, for instance, sorry about this, on the representation of Black females, you will find that there's even a more skewed representation. So we will not find an equal representation of groups in our midst, in the science environment. This will also have an impact on how people feel once they entered science, whether they feel at home in science, whether they feel that they can contribute as they should be able to do so, given a fair representation in science. So let's take a look at a few, and as you can see during this presentation, it's all very limited in terms of the data that I can show you, but let's take a look at a few considerations of the psychological impact of a lack of diversity and inclusion in science. If you are seeing less people in science, the question is, well, what are the reasons behind this? And both within but also outside of the science population, people are seeing different reasons why there are so few, for instance, women or people of color compared to what we should expect in science. And so these data are again from the Pew Research Center. The first column is reasons why women are not in STEM jobs according to the general population. And the right column is why people think that people of color, Blacks, Hispanics, for instance, are not as much in science as we should expect. And what you can find is that people feel that there's really a lot of discrimination going on in recruitment, hiring, and promotion. This goes both for women and also here for people of color. But what is interesting also is to see is that with regard to people of color, most people feel that they are less likely to have access to quality education to prepare them for STEM fields. And of course, this may be even more so in the US situation than in Europe or even in the Netherlands. But for instance, our faculty is involved in several initiatives, outreach initiatives through our former Student Impact Center, for instance, in mentoring and tutoring pupils from high schools in the area of Science Park, because we know that from these schools, less pupils are entering Science Park, are entering our education, university education in general, often also because they are under-advised. And once you enter an environment in which there are less of your own group, and for instance, you also don't have any role models in the higher ranks of your own group. So for instance, less female professors, less full professors of color. It also has an impact on your sense of belonging, as many studies show. So again, as scientists and as science, we are harming ourselves by not allowing, not welcoming groups compared to their presence in society. Another consequence of this is that it will impact also the creativity of our science. So if people don't feel as much welcome, so for instance, if there's not a positive climate within the organization, the creativity and innovation that we might expect from a diverse group of scientists, much more than from a homogeneous group of scientists, that expected diversity, innovation and creativity will be less than in an environment in which diverse groups feel really welcomed and that they belong into this environment. So not only is it a matter of creating a welcoming environment, but also then creating the conditions in which these different groups can really equally contribute and then contribute to the innovation that they might bring to us as scientists and science as a whole. So we are moving from outward, from ethical considerations to societal considerations, and then we went to psychological considerations. Now let's see what it means really for the functions that science can perform. Functions in society. And we might then consider three different dimensions that the lack of diversity might have an impact upon. Like, who is setting the agenda for science? Who is looking into the dissemination of the results of scientific research? And who is really looking for the implementations of the results of science, or the implementations in new policies and new technologies. So science has a lot to offer to society. However, it may be that if science is less diverse and less inclusive, then actually what science has to offer is also less optimal than it would have been in a much more inclusive science. Now here, for instance, we might compare the need for knowledge that different groups of different countries have, for instance, and the supply of knowledge. So as science, we are supplying knowledge, but we might wonder, well, are we really catering? Are we really doing research for those groups or those areas that are really in need the most of our knowledge? And these graphs are taken from an interesting article on climate change research. And what it shows, and it will probably not really surprise you, what it shows is that those areas with the highest annual temperature, with the most unstable, politically unstable environments, and with the least energy consumption. So these areas, global areas, which might suffer the most from climate change and have benefited the least from energy consumption, well, these are also the areas that are least researched. So most research on climate change and its impact on particular areas are actually from Western countries, so or the global north, if you like, West Europe and North America. So most climate research is on these areas, even though we are the least vulnerable to climate change effects. We have benefited the most from energy consumption, and still we are not doing our best to investigate how we can help, for instance, in mitigation or adaptation to climate change in the global south, where people will suffer the most. And something similar is at stake in medical research, for instance. Medical research, as you probably know, has performed a lot of research, but mainly on male bodies, so on men. Assuming that the results will apply to women equally, but they don't. So women have been undertreated in heart disease, in diabetes, in depression, etc., because their symptoms are different from the symptoms that have been extensively studied in men. The treatments are different, etc., etc. So if we are less inclusive and less diverse, it may also have an impact on the agendas, the questions that we are researching. And as you may understand, this is not only unfair and unjust, but in the end, it will also come back at us. Here again, there are some studies that show that GWAS, genome, apologies, genome-wide studies are much more about European test subjects and the European genomes, even though that we know that African populations show much more genetic diversity, which might be of interest also from a medical perspective, for instance, to the global populations. But scientists are often just like this man looking for his keys under the lampposts, because it's easier to find your keys in a convenient setting like under a lamppost, even though it might be more interesting and more relevant to go out of your way and, for instance, to travel all the way to America. Something similar is in animal model studies. Until recently, most animal studies used only male animals, because female models are more expensive, are more difficult to treat, to use in your studies because of obvious reasons. So the underrepresentation of females or of non-European subjects in genetic and medical studies really has an impact on our science. And something similar is visible right now, for instance, in the distribution of a COVID vaccine, where we may ask, well, as scientists, we have worked together to create the COVID vaccine, supported by public funding. But now we are witnessing that the spread of the vaccine or the availability of the vaccine is not equally distributed over the global population. So we should ask ourselves, are we doing science a favor? Are we doing the global population a favor? But also, shouldn't we as scientists uphold some norms, some values as scientists that have an impact also in the dissemination of our results? So we should not just look at how we are doing in the lab, but maybe also take into account how do our results contribute to global welfare, to global health. Finally, final perspective that I wanted to show here is how the lack of diversity and inclusion might have an impact upon how we function as scientists or as science, really internally. So how, for instance, how are our collaborations affected by a lack of diversity and inclusion? How effective are we? Does our education work optimally? Of course, I won't answer all these questions because, again, I will be relatively brief, but during the discussion time in a couple of minutes, we may add some further insights. So when we're thinking about diversity, Catherine Phillips argued in her very interesting article, Why Diversity Makes Us Smarter, published in Scientific American. She says, well, we have to look at two different forms of informational diversity. The diversity of expertise, so depending upon your training, your PhD projects, etc., etc. But there's also social diversity. The diversity that you bring as a member of social groups, as a society, and which may differ from one group to another. So we always bring our experiences, values, and norms as being part of a particular group and society to the table. And as many studies in organizations, businesses, and also science teams have shown, this social diversity also matters to how we function as science. It enhances the creativity and innovation of our science. And in this figure from an article that I published a couple of years ago, I tried to show why this is the case. Whenever we are working with people with a different expertise, but also with different experiences and norms and values, it forces us to make explicit all these assumptions, all the normative assumptions, but also practical assumptions that we typically uphold only in an implicit sense. So what are important topics to investigate? How are we going to approach a particular topic? What methods will we use? How are we going to disseminate, to publish or use our results? All these kind of questions we often don't make explicit to each other, but once we are in a team with people with very different backgrounds, maybe different languages, different expectations, etc., it creates a situation where we are forced to make all these norms and values and maybe interests explicit, and that really helps our collaborations. So bringing diversity in our groups really also helps us to become better, not just as collaborators, but also as scientists. And again, if we then realize that, for instance, within science, we have much less representations of people with disabilities and chronic disorders. So here again, American data show that about 10% should be considered like coping with a disability. And in non-science and engineering occupations, there's already a loss of 2% of them. But within science, there's even less. There are only 6% of those with disabilities. Well, somehow we are losing talents, but we're also losing people who bring a different social information, different sets of experiences, norms, interests, etc., and networks. So we have to do better in making us a more welcoming and inclusive environment. Now, in a way, summing it all up, in a way, much of what I just said was prefigured by the sociologist Merton's 4 norms that he presented, partly like inspired by what went on during the Second World War, where he started to see that scientists were not by themselves really morally making moral arguments about their participation in a war effort, or maybe trying to not being involved in war crimes. Already in 1942, we saw these problems appearing. And Merton said, well, as scientists, we are upholding these 4 norms just by doing science. We are sharing data, so we should uphold the norm of communism or communalism. In doing our science, we should also embrace universalism. That is, we should not play any political, social factors a role. We should also do this in a disinterested way, so no personal or political agendas, no economic gains, for instance. If we don't do that, then the result will be that we are no longer trusted as scientists. And what is also peculiar to science is that we are organizing, in a way, skepticism within our process of doing science. I think of conferences, peer review publications, etc. Now, these 4 norms are the norms that we as scientists should embrace and should continue in a way performing, upholding. And when we are lacking in diversity in our midst, in a way, all of these norms are in some way really impeded, are hampered. So again, even doing our best as scientists should imply that we are also really taking care of the diversity and inclusion in our midst. At the UvA, there's a diversity policy that we are trying to implement at all levels of the UvA. And as you can see, I'm not going to go into detail here, but there are a few objectives that resonate with the foregoing. We've discussed the accessibility, which is really a matter of justice and fairness. So we are trying to make up for the lack of equal access for several pupils, high school pupils, and we are also trying to improve the study success for underrepresented groups, for instance, or first generation students who tend to have a more difficult time at the UvA than others. But we also trying to improve the successful collaboration within teams, which means offering courses in intercultural communication, for instance, something that during the Faces of Science Park week, you might also try to follow a workshop about on Thursday afternoon. And then the recruitment and selection and retention of staff is also a matter of our concern at UvA. Again, this will also contribute to greater diversity and inclusion of science. Well, I'm going to stop the recording now so we can have some time for discussion about these issues.